So today we're here with Dr. Dan Nayot of TRIO Fertility. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Nayot.
A pleasure.
Dr. Nayot will be talking to us about how to read your embryology chart, which is basically, from my experience, it looks like another language. So we're really excited to have you here and explain that to us. Dr. Nayot also has a presentation to share, so take it away. And if you have any questions, please ask using Zoom, and I'll hopefully be able to see them and read them out. Take it away.
All right, thanks for having me for your lunchtime break. So this is part of the Figuring Out Fertility series at Fertility Matters Canada, which is a pretty awesome initiative. We were brainstorming what we think people may not know. A lot of times I talk to patients and sometimes they know more than me about some subtopics because they go deep into the internet. I think this is a good one that unless you had a dictionary, you may not know what you're looking at. So hopefully I can provide some insights. Now, I'm not an embryologist, I'm a clinician, so I'm a fertility specialist, but obviously this is the language we speak. So, I mean, I'm a big advocate. I think all patients who go through IVF should have a look at their embryology chart. Even if you can't read it, you should have it, you should understand it, you should understand what the feedback is and things like that. So hopefully this can provide some insights. Feel free to interrupt me as I go along. So just fertility 101 for 1 second. For a natural conception, what we have usually, I'm assuming you guys can see my cursor, but you can see a follicle growing in the ovary. So this is what we can see on ultrasound. So people going through monitoring every day and getting ultrasounds, we pretty much just see a black circle, but we can't actually see the egg. The egg is tiny and microscopic. In a natural cycle, this little egg will make its way into the tube. The sperm will somehow, make its way all the way to the tube. The tube will fertilize, the embryo will grow over 5 or 6 days and actually hatches out and implants. So one thing I always tell my patients is, based on blood work and ultrasound, we're talking about before IVF, if you're doing cycle monitoring or insemination, we really have no clue what's happening on the inside. We can see follicles, we can see lining, but we have nothing, we don't know anything in between. So any month that we're not pregnant, we really don't know where things were like stuck. Like, did the egg not make it to the tube? Did the sperm not make it to the egg? Did it not fertilize? Did it stop growing? Or was there a perfect embryo but just never implanted? Okay. When you do IVF, you get to see that sort of like the middle. Okay. This is what an embryology chart may look like. Some are paper form. This is an electronic version. There are several companies. This one is Baby Century, but there's IVF and whatnot. But it might look something like that. So I'm hoping this looks like foreign language to you now, and I can explain it at the end. But on the left side here, we can see the number of mature eggs. ICSI is the type of fertilization, what happened on the next day, and what happened to those embryos. But again, I'm hoping this looks like gibberish to you, and then when we come back at the end, it will make sense to you. Okay, so keep this image in your head. Okay, when we think about getting pregnant, we always sort of divide it into seed versus soil. Seed is like the embryo, soil is sort of the environment. So anytime, let's say we put an embryo back and we're not pregnant, or we put an embryo back and it's a miscarriage, we're always thinking, okay, was it like the wrong embryo? Was it the perfect? Or could we have supported something from the soil point of view? So for us, seed means embryo, which is obviously a combination of egg and sperm. And soil, we mean sort of the endometrium that we put it in. And there's several, we can go a little bit deeper into each. But on the top left here, you can see a picture of what we call a blastocyst. So this is a day 5 or day 6 embryo. This is a nice looking embryo. And by the end of this, you'll be able to tell me that yourself. And on the right here is a picture of a hysteroscopy. So that's someone putting a camera in. The reason it's distended is because we actually filled up with fluid here. It's not usually like that. Usually the uterus is sort of collapsed together. But you can see the endometrium. But like we always tell people, there's millions of microscopic stuff we can't see. We can't see like blood flow and receptors and immune response and infections and stuff like that. So the soil is complicated and the embryo is complicated, but we need both to succeed. Okay, the other thing I sort of hear myself saying a lot is that IVF is both diagnostic and therapeutic. So obviously no one goes through IVF just to like find out what's going on. We're all doing IVF because we're trying to get pregnant, but in the process you learn a lot. In a simplified version is if you go through IVF and get a whole bunch of eggs, but at the end of it, you have no embryos, you could probably deduct that probably the problems with the seed, not the soil. You never even made it to the transfer part. The reverse is if you have a whole bunch of, quote unquote, perfect embryos and you're transferring and you're transferring and you're transferring and it's not succeeding, probably, maybe it's not the embryo that's the issue, but maybe the soil. Okay. I mean, that's a simplified version, but it makes logical sense. So let's talk about the three parts, the egg, the sperm, and then the combination to make embryos. So first things first, again, the follicle is what we see in ultrasound is a big black circle, okay? Then we go in there and we drain that follicle to try to find an egg, but I can't on ultrasound find an egg. So everybody always assumes on day of egg collection that there's 6 big follicles and therefore I'm gonna have 6 eggs, and that would be great, but sometimes you have 5 or 3 or none. Now, when eggs come out, it kind of looks like this. So in this picture, you can see the egg here and lots of cells around it. That's what it looks like when the embryologist first gets it. It's called a cumulus cell. If you sort of strip it down a little bit, this is sort of cut down version of what it looks like. And if you go even further, this is called a stripped egg. We took all the cells out of it. That's what most people think about when they say an egg. So this is what an egg looks like. But that requires the embryologist to strip it down. Now, the first important thing to know is when we look at the eggs, we always say, actually, let me go back. There is a difference between IVF and ICSI, or intracytoplasmic sperm injection. So IVF means we take the egg complex and we put, let's say 50,000 sperm around the egg and we let natural selection do its thing. So this is important because in IVF, we keep these cells on. Okay, that's an important point because that means we can't actually see too much about the egg. So a lot of times when you do IVF instead of ICSI, there's no real feedback on the egg because you couldn't see it. I mean, you can see in this picture, it's not really much information you get out of that. When you do ICSI, you've got to clean out the egg, so stripping the egg, and then you pick one sperm and you drill it through. So that's really one important point. Once we see the eggs, so let's say we strip the eggs, the first thing we say, is it a mature egg or is it an immature egg? So another way of saying mature egg is an M2, which means it went through the second cycle of meiosis. A lot of people write it as Roman numerals, MII, so M2. As a general rule, mature eggs we use, immature eggs we discard. So already you always get drop off. So let's say 10 follicles, 8 eggs, 6 mature, okay, before you even use those eggs. So how can we tell if an egg is mature or not? The first thing we do is we can see if it has a polar body. So this is the egg, this is the shell of the egg, and this is a polar body. Oh, I think I don't have that picture here. But it's pretty black and white to know if something is mature. So you need a polar body and you need nothing, no nucleus inside. So the embryologists it's pretty like black and white, immature versus mature. So there's no real subjectivity to that. Okay, so we could tell mature or not. So a good example is someone who freezes their eggs. We only freeze the mature eggs. The next question we get almost all the time is like, great, tell me about my eggs. Are they good eggs? Are they bad eggs? What's the egg score? And the craziest part about this whole thing is that there is no egg scoring system. There isn't a way to look at the egg and say, this is a 9 out of 10, or this is a B- or something like that. It doesn't exist, okay? So it doesn't mean embryologists can't see things. So if you can see this pictures, all trained embryologists can sort of pick up little things that are that can be seen, like vacuole, smooth endoplasmic reticulums, asymmetry, large polar bodies. The list goes on and on. But there is no single, we call it dysmorphism. No single dysmorphism is consistently known to be a good or a bad thing. So we can't go through a checklist and say, okay, you've got this blue dot, that's -1 point. You've got this green dot, that's +4 points, or anything like that. So no one's ever been able to create an egg scoring system. So now I'm going to do a shameless plug because I have this platform. That's sort of the problem I've been trying to solve using artificial intelligence. So I founded a company called TRIO Fertility, shameless plug right here in the top right. And the idea is I thought maybe artificial intelligence image analysis can solve that. So if you take thousands of pictures of eggs and you know exactly what happened to the eggs, I feel very confident that with the right AI machine, you can correlate a good egg versus a bad egg. So that's what we're doing here at TRIO Fertility. So we take pictures of eggs and we non-invasively analyzing to try to give us an outcome prediction. But for everyone at the moment, the current standard of care is yes, we can see a lot of things about the eggs, but no, there is no egg scoring system. So when
Sorry,
we tell you,
can I interrupt with
yeah,
a quick question? Is that why it's so hard to diagnose egg quality? Because there's just no way to tell?
there's no way. We base it on outcomes. So if 4 eggs turn into 4 embryos into 4 babies, we say, guess what? You have amazing eggs. If 25 eggs with good sperm turn into no embryos, we say we're really concerned about your egg quality.
Right.
So it's just logical deduction. Where you see the stressor the most, like what do you mean you don't know anything about my eggs, is the egg freezers. So somebody who goes through social egg freezing, and we'll pick a certain demographic, let's say she's 35 and she got 10 eggs. We literally go to historical charts and say, okay, traditionally 10 eggs in a 35-year-old is a 50% chance. But really, you might have 3 kids in there, or 1, or not even, none of them even have a chance. You don't know. And so in the egg freezing, we just tell them how many mature eggs, and we just go based on age. So we almost just assume each egg is the same for each age group. Crazy, right? Okay, so that's the
More
egg.
like unfair.
Unfair. Well, the future will change. So sperm, we do a much better job at it. Even before IVF, we have an insight about the sperm because it comes out of our body. Of course, eggs don't come out of our body till we do IVF. So we usually look at sperm several ways. Volume, how much semen comes out. Concentration, how many millions of sperm per millimeter. Motility, how many sperm are actually moving forward. Those are the ones we think have to get to the egg and drill through. And morphology, how many of them look normal. So again, all grading systems are like subjective and there's gray areas, but it's it's good to weed out the extremes. So sperm, we have a pretty good way to analyze them. On the left here, you can see a picture of a whole bunch of sperms under the microscope. One thing to know is like the embryologist or inside the IVF lab, they actually they don't just take your sperm and deal with it like that. There's a whole preparation that they have to do. They have to clean it and prepare it and spin it and select it. So a good example is sperm injection, ICSI. We pick a good looking sperm, like the head and the neck and the tail and the fast swimming sperm. We sort of try to track it down. We cut off its tail so it doesn't move anymore. And we take the head of the sperm and we drill it right through the eggs. Okay, so put egg and sperm together and you've got embryos. So I would say there's 3 ways for us to evaluate embryos, and one of them is morphokinetics. How is the embryo developing over the 5 or 6 days? And we'll talk about each one in more details. One is the grading. Visually, when we look at it, that's sort of the score everybody talks about. What was your embryo like? I had a 4AA. Oh, I only had a 2BC, things like that. We'll talk about that. And then sort of selection criteria. So some of them is the traditional way, like somehow we have to pick based on what we see. Some of them are like chromosome testing of the embryos. And some of them, again, using artificial intelligence to help us select. These are just really cool pictures of embryos under electron microscope that other people don't get to see. But the point is, it's like a really rapidly developing thing in 5 days. Like it goes from 1 cell to hundreds of cells in 5 days. Okay, so let's start with step 1, morphokinetics. So morphokinetics is how have things evolved. So the standard way we look at embryos, or the old school way, is we used to have these like incubators. These are like big black boxes with very controlled light and pH and oxygen. And we put the embryos in there, and once a day we would bring them out and just look, did it fertilize it or not? Did it grow or not? And sort of document stages of development. Many clinics still do that. That's not bad at all. The new version of that is what's called a time-lapse incubator. So just think of the same kind of incubator and someone put like an iPhone on top. So it's just snapping a picture every few minutes and sort of creates this time-lapse. The beauty of that is you have more data points. You get to watch the whole development, and you never really have to remove the embryos, which is another part. But here on the right is sort of the static pictures. So So here is day 1, did it fertilized or not? So you might see the term 2PN, which means 2 pronuclei. So you can see here a nucleus and a nucleus. One's from the egg, one's from the sperm. And eventually they will fuse together. So that is the sort of standard definition of this egg fertilized or not. Maybe I'm going sort of off-road, but what's interesting to me is there are, I don't know, there are certain people who believe, you know, the definition of like what's a human, what's an embryo, what's life is like a complex thing that I'm not going to jump into at all. But some people would say, well, this might be the two pronuclei because that means fertilization. And some people think, no, it's right after that when they fuse together, when the mom and dad genes put together. So the first day we see, did it fertilize or not? And these are sort of binary events. So if you didn't fertilize, you're like out of the running. So again, we have drop off, 10 follicles, 8 eggs, 6 mature, 5 fertilized. Okay. I would say almost automatically, so not all the time, but pretty consistently, once you've reached a fertilized egg, it will almost automatically grow to, let's say, day 3. Not at the same high quality, but almost automatically. So you can see it now split into 2 cells, and here's 4 cells, and here's 8 cells. So as a general rule, we're kind of like Goldilocks. We don't want too slow. We don't want too fast. We like symmetry. We're simple people. We like 4 cells. We like 8 cells. We don't really like 3 to 7, something like that. But of course, that doesn't mean that's no good and that's good. It's just sort of guidelines for us to work with. So cleavage stage embryos are considered day 2 or day 3 embryos. I would say back in the day, we used to always transfer on day 2 or day 3. And we used to transfer more of them because it would take more just to get to the finish line. Nowadays, it's pretty standard of care to grow all the way to blastocyst. One thing I think patients don't know is they know that we evaluate on day 2 and 3, and they know that we evaluate on day 5, and everyone says, how come you don't evaluate on day 4? You guys skip the day. And the truth is the embryo sort of goes through what's called cavitation. It almost becomes like opaque in between, and so you can't really see much. So it's kind of like a black box, so there's nothing really to report. So on day 4, we kind of skip our assessment. This is sort of pre-blastocyst, and then it becomes a blastocyst. So I would say there's several bottlenecks, but one of them is ectofertilization. That's a huge milestone. Another one is at day 3 to a blastocyst, and then of course blastocyst to implantation. So in the bottom here, you can sort of see the same sort of development, 2 cells, 3 cells, 4 cells, but now you're capturing it in real time, 19 hours, 34 hours, so forth. Any questions?
I was going to say that's really interesting because a lot of times, or when I've talked to people going through this, they want to know what's going on with their embryos every day, but they're getting every other day updates, and this is why. So that's really interesting. Yeah. Also, a lot of my embryos in the past, a lot of them were frozen on day 6. Is there a difference between day 5 and day 6? And does a day 6 produce a better outcome?
So it's a good question. So here you can see blastocysts. We always like automatically say day 5, but really it's usually day 5 or day 6. If you took any little question in fertility, and asked 2 fertility doctors, you get 3 opinions. So day 5 versus day 6 is a good one. So most people, I think, would argue that day 5 probably is a better prognosis than day 6. And some people think it makes no difference if the other parameters are fine. And some people say even a normal day 5 versus a normal day 6, there's a difference. So I'm not sure. You're going to find arguments on both sides. But either way, once you have a blastocyst, we don't give up on it. Eventually, it's getting transferred.
Right. Okay. And I've heard that some clinics are starting to even introduce day 7 embryos. They have a higher chance of success, I think, but that's still something that's kind of coming onto the table now. Is that right? Yeah.
So again, there's 2 parts. So if embryos arrest, like there's no more growth, then they're just not viable. But if embryos are slowly tinkering along, then we wonder if like day 7 could give us viability. So again, Goldilocks, like the extreme of the tail, you can make 2 arguments. You can make an argument, if this has any percentage chance, why wouldn't you save it and put it in? And you can make an argument, if this has such a low chance of success, like you understand how much burden and emotion and finances the patient has to go through to put it in. So I think it's really dependent on the scenario. So if it's someone who without IVF has no chance, which isn't, I wouldn't say that's most IVF cycles, then, and they can't possibly do another cycle, I can understand that argument. If we think, this may lead to a miscarriage, why are you putting someone through it? The point is, it's a complicated discussion.
Right.
I politically got away from that. That was good. Okay, so that was morphokinetics, like how is it developing on day 2 and day 3, and when does it become a blastocyst, day 5 or day 6? The next one is grading. I think this is the one everybody sort of throws around. So one thing you should know is that there's multiple grading systems. This is just probably the one you heard about is the most popular one, but like sometimes different labs evaluate it differently. This is called the Schoolcraft-Gardner grading system. And so essentially it's a number 1 to 6, and then a grade A, B, C, and then a grade A, B, C. So the first thing is the number is sort of about the expansion. So if you can walk down here, you can see 6 is a fully hatched embryo. You can see here the previous shell, and this embryo is huge and already out of its shell, like completely come out. So that's a 6. 5, you can see it's sort of like mushrooming out, it's herniating. 4, it's like expanding, about to herniate. 3 is sort of an average size, and 2 is just becoming. We don't really say 1. 1 is kind of a pre-blastocyst, so you won't really hear people saying, I have a 1 cc. They might say, like, I have a 2 cc. So again, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is just stage of development. One really important point, though, is like, you know, it makes sense that 6 sounds better than 4. It's more advanced. You have to appreciate that in the lab, there's like a workflow. So if again, I'm not the embryologist, but if I come in the morning and I check on Vidya's embryos, and today it's a 3AB, I say, great, it's reached a blastocyst, I'm gonna freeze it. I'm not sitting there for 3 hours saying, I'm waiting for it to turn to a 4, and then 9 p.m. waiting for it to turn to a 5. So everyone has to appreciate, we just, you know, we're hoping that eventually we'll continue to evolve after we thaw and put in the uterus. Okay, so 3 versus 4 versus 5, you know, some of it is actually just logistics. You know, did they check your embryos the first thing in the morning, or were you later in the afternoon, kind of thing?
And that explains why, like, you know, if I look at my previous embryos, they were all graded well and they didn't result in a baby. But I have friends who had embryos that were graded less well, and they were successful. So it's, even if you have a great grading, it doesn't guarantee you a baby. And even if you have less optimal grading, it doesn't mean that your chances are over.
Right. So grading is just one point. Then there's morphokinetics, and then there's chromosomes, which we'll talk about. But all of them are just sort of guidances. Like none of this is black and white, guaranteed baby, guaranteed no baby. Like, right. Unfortunately, in fertility, we live in the gray area. Everything is gray. Okay. So the number is sort of the level of expansion, and then ABC is a subjective feeling about how many cells we have. So general, like life, viability, lots of cells, growth. So A means lots of cells, C means very few cells, and B is somewhere in between A and C. So for example, and so the first letters is what we call the inner cell mass. That's actually where the baby is growing. And the second letter is the outer cell mass. That's what the placenta is going to be. Okay. So here's an example of a 2 cc. This is like a small embryo with not many cells on the inside and not many cells on the outside. Here's an example of a 5AA, like already herniating out, tons of cells everywhere, where we feel really good about. As you said, this might be a beautiful baby, and this may be a negative pregnancy test. Okay, but it makes sense on average that this would do better. Okay. Okay, that's the embryo grading. Other forms of selection. So one of them is the traditional. So every lab has their own criteria, but these are trained embryologists, and they say, well, I like the speed of this one, and I like the grade of this one, and I like the symmetry of that one, but I didn't like what I saw here in the cleavage stage, so I'm picking this one. So this is a trained professional saying, this is the go-to embryo. One thing I see, at least from the other side of the office, obviously we're talking about like the first embryo transfer, hope is high for me and the patient, and if it works, amazing, and if it doesn't work, you see this big drop of hope, because there's this perception that the best embryo didn't work, and therefore nothing's going to work. And I always try to prepare patients beforehand that, like, I wish we were that smart and knew exactly which one to pick, but like, you got to keep going.
Well, that actually relates to a question that just came in. I have a question regarding transferring 2 embryos at day 3, one higher and one lower quality. I saw some research saying that there are decreased chances of pregnancy compared to only transferring one high quality embryo because of the effect on the endometrium, i.e. the body is potentially rejecting the lower quality embryo. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so again, on day 3 embryos, in my honest opinion, you don't really know too much about the embryos. They could both turn into beautiful blastocysts. They both could have arrested the next day. So it's kind of, for me, it's too early to tell too much about the embryo. Of course, if they turn into twins, they were both great. But if they didn't work, again, you don't really know if that was the embryo or that was the environment. The question here is, are embryos independent, or do they have an impact on each other? Do putting 2 embryos help each other if they're both good? Do they hurt each other if one's not good? They've done many studies on this, and like all the answers you've heard up to date, like no one really knows. But it goes like this. I think when you look at studies, you need to look at the trend and the pattern in the studies. And I think what goes into the news feeds of people is the latest study, not like the cohorts of studies that's been done. So generally, we assume the embryos are actually pretty independent. We know this because there's been many studies where we put 2 nice blastocysts in, or 2 blastocysts versus 1, and if it doesn't work, 1. And the cumulative rate, like, did you have a baby after 2 transfers? 1 is very similar. But once in a while, you will see a study that says, hey, if you put a bad-looking embryo, it might have a negative impact. I mean, the truth is we don't know for sure the answer. My gut feeling is I'm going to bet against that. I think they're kind of independent, because if you think almost of like stimulation IUI, when we're releasing 4 eggs, that's probably some embryos there, and they're probably all interacting. So I don't think we have to do, I mean, the aim in our field is 1 embryo at a time, because we're not aiming for twins, we're aiming for 1. When we put 2 embryos, it's in the hopes that 1 of them will take. But my feeling is, my personal feeling, I'm not sure if everybody would agree, is I think they're relatively independent. Okay. So there's the traditional way of choosing embryos. There is chromosome testing. So we know that not all embryos are going to be chromosomally normal. And we think having normal chromosomes is a prerequisite to having a live birth. So, 46 chromosomes is what we're aiming for. As a general rule, if you're missing chromosomes, so less than 46, so I don't know if you guys can see this one. Oh, there isn't one that's missing one, but so let's say you have 45 or 44. We think that's an embryo that's just not even going to implant. And if you have 46 and then some, like an extra one, so here you see embryo number 4 has an extra chromosome 16, we think that's an embryo that's going to implant and miscarry. So this is a general rule. So that's why when you do, most embryos that have chromosomal problems will not make it to 8, 9, 10 weeks. We think they'll miscarry before, but some will. One that we always hear about is Down syndrome. So Down syndrome is an extra chromosome 21. And if anybody knows about the NIPT test, the non-invasive prenatal test, so once you're pregnant, you can check the chromosomes. They're checking chromosome 21, 18, and 13, because we think those are the only ones that can make it that far. The other ones would have miscarried. And again, they're always trisomies. They're always the extra chromosome. Okay? I shouldn't say always, but that's the good rule of thumb. So one thing we can do is test those embryos. So this is, I just got this off the internet. It's not a real patient of mine, but 4 embryos, 2 of them are normal, 2 are not. Okay? So we would say, even though embryo number 1 and embryo 4 looked great and maybe would have implanted and you would have been pregnant but then would have miscarried, it's probably not the right embryo. Nowadays, you could do a whole session on chromosome testing, like pros and cons and who for and who not. So these are sort of biopsies that we take from the outer cell. Nowadays, what everyone's sort of working on is the non-invasive. So almost like in the culture media where the embryo is, if you can just sort of if you can just analyze the fluid that's being secreted from the embryo, then maybe you don't have to harm the embryo. I like to call it the garbage can theory. So like you can tell a lot about someone's house by going through their garbage. But I think that's for sure, in our lifetime, that's for sure going to become standard of care. It's getting close now. I am big into the artificial intelligence. I will now not self-promote myself, but a friend of mine, a competitor, but I think they're doing a great job, called Life Whisper. And they're doing the same sort of thing. Like, let us look at your eggs, and maybe using AI image analysis, we can choose a little bit better than the embryologist. Okay, any questions before I keep going?
We do have one question that came in. How do you feel about the biopsy to time the best day for transfer? Last year, we did a transfer that confirmed my body was ready for a day 5, day 4, day 6 transfer, but the embryo was a day 5 blasto.
Okay, so I think that's obviously a very specific question to someone. But what I think they're talking about is the soil part, not the seed part. So I think they're talking about a test that we can sometimes do on the endometrium to try to figure out the best time or the window of implantation. And sometimes we say, hey, this was a great embryo, but we put it in, it didn't work. Maybe we put it in the wrong time or not enough support. I mean, that's a whole other lecture of how to support the endometrium or how to maximize implantation. But I think that's what that question was about. So yes. If I recall, the question is, how do I feel about?
So what I think I'm reading is the test is coming back saying that they're receptive on not on day 5,
right,
but the embryo is a day 5 embryo.
Yeah.
So is that an area of concern?
So again, I can't comment on a specific case, but the idea is, like, generally we put like a blastocyst at day 5 or day 6 embryo on like the 5th or 6th days of progesterone, because we think that makes sense in terms of like synchrony, right? Like kind of like, you know, on our bodies as the embryo grows and grows and grows, like at the same time the lining is being prepared and prepared and prepared. So we're trying to synchronize it. So there are some tests out there and ultrasound findings that sort of say, well, maybe for this patient, she metabolizes progesterone different, or not enough receptors or enzyme metabolism or whatever. And maybe for her, she needs 2 extra days of progesterone before we put the embryo in, or maybe 1 less day. I think that's what the question is. So personalized day of embryo transfer, I think it makes sense as a theory. I mean, I can't really comment on the specifics.
Okay. I know that there's like a lot of, or that there's a question on how effective the testing is. Do you have an opinion on that?
For which test?
The receptive endometrium test.
the truth is, I'd have to come back and give you guys another lecture on endometrial receptivity. There's several tests. I think they're probably referring to what's probably the most, you know, common one that people hear about, which is ERA, endometrial receptivity assay. The idea there is, instead of doing the transfer, you take a biopsy. So it's like a mock cycle. And then you look for the proteins being secreted, and it sort of should tell you if it's in the receptive area, had you put a good embryo and you think it would have worked, or pre-receptive or post-receptive. I feel like all science and fertility, it's complicated, and I think it should be part of the whole workup. Like what I tell my patients is, like, it's rarely like so black and white, but like as long as you use logic and patterns to figure out the next step, I think eventually you'll get there.
Great answer.
Okay. So hopefully some of that made sense. So now we can go back to this chart and hopefully some of it makes sense. So here you can see 13 eggs were taken out, but 11 of them were M11s or M2s. So now you know that this patient had 13 eggs, but 11 mature, 2 immature. So you can see nothing to the right here because we discarded those 2 immatures. So now we're really just dealing with 11 mature eggs. In this patient, you'll see something called COC. Those are markers. That is the embryologist commenting on something he sees by the egg, but we all know that that's not really an egg score. I can't go to her and say egg 2 and 3 are terrible and egg 6, 7, 8 are no good or something like that, because really it's what happens to these eggs. Okay. So 2 types of insemination: traditional IVF or ICSI. So this person took ICSI, and again, we just need 11 sperm because we have 11 eggs. Here is the sperm numbers, concentration, motility, morphology, when they gave us the sample, and post means after we processed it. So So we take the sperm, 11 sperm, and inject it. So then we checked about fertilization. So you see the word here, 2PN, 2 pronuclei. So we can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 out of the 11 eggs fertilized, which is kind of statistically what we expect. And 3 of them have a comment of DEG, which means degeneration. It means we poked the egg and it almost deflated like a balloon. Okay, so 3 eggs deflated, didn't fertilize, and 8 fertilized. Like my comment before, almost automatically a fertilized eggs will make it to a day 3 embryo. So you can see here day 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 out of those 8 fertilized eggs made it to a blastocyst. So you can see the drop-off continues. Even there, you can already see differences. So this is a 4-cell and a 13-cell. This is a 5-cell and a 10-cell, a 4-cell and a 9-cell, and things like that. And then we find out if it became a blastocyst. It can become a blastocyst on day 5 or on day 6. So this egg number 3 was a nice looking day 3 embryo and then arrested. Egg 4 also arrested. Egg 6 and 7 on day 5 was almost a blastocyst and then became a 4BB and became a 3BB. So this is someone who has 5 blastocysts frozen. Again, which embryo to choose now, it depends on the lab. So some labs will pick a day 5 over a day 6. Some labs will pick the highest grading, so like a 4AB over 4BB. But it's really important that everybody understands there's a lot of subjectiveness. So it's been shown over and over that you get 2 embryologists to look the same thing. It's not going to be exactly the same. You ask the embryologist to go grab a coffee and come back. It's not going to be the same thing. Mm-hmm. And it's not their fault. Like, the embryo turns and it's dynamic and it changes. Even before freezing and post-thawing, it can look different. So some labs will pick day 5, some labs will pick the most advanced day 5, and some labs will look at the morphokinetics. So they might say, you know what, I'm picking the day 5s. Should I do the 4AB or the 4BB? Well, I don't really like that this is so fast growing and asymmetric. It jumped all the way from 4 to 13. This seems a lot more on pattern to me, but this was multinucleated, this wasn't, and so I'm going with embryo number 1. Wish me luck. Yeah. So those are things, unless of course you test these embryos and then you sort of deselect based on the chromosomes then. All right, I think that would be my embryology reading 101. Any questions out there?
Yes. 2, 3. After egg quality, what do you think is the most challenging or misunderstood part of fertility science?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So after egg quality, what is the most misunderstood? I would say probably the endometrial receptivity would be a huge one. It's another topic, but it's such a complex thing that most of us just simplify it into how thick is our lining? Our lining's too thin, it's not going to work, cancel. Our lining's thick enough, great, go for it, which is way too simple. Now there's more ultrasound. Now you can look at the patterns and the changes with progesterone and some of these ERA tests, and now there's sort of like underlying infection tests. But I think the endometrium and receptivity is like a black box. Like, we literally don't know. This window of implantation is a nice theory and it makes sense, but we don't know, is it the same for everyone? Can it shift? Should we look at it like a force field on and off, like this cycle, it's just off no matter what you do and you shouldn't have gone for it, or things like that?
So we'll have to bring you back for that talk another day.
But I'm going to answer a different question. I'm working on AI now and I'm super passionate about it. The one thing, if I could invent, was I wish we can find a way to see the egg on the ultrasound. Like, if I can tell someone, whether it's like, well, you don't want to make it radioactive because that's probably not a good outcome, but there's some way to see on the ultrasound that, like, hey, this follicle didn't have an egg and you're not pregnant. Like, it wasn't because you were stressed and it wasn't because we didn't give you enough progesterone. I just think, like, in the pre-IVF world, we can see follicles, we can see lining, but we don't see anything in between. And I always wish that we can at least, because I have this theory that I think a lot of infertility is because sperm and egg are not meeting, which is what IVF fixes.
Mm-hmm. Approximately what improvements in fertilization percentage with use of oocyte spindle view?
Mm-hmm.
So how is oocyte spindle view improving the fertilization process?
So I don't have a picture of spindle view here. So spindle view, if you can see this picture of the egg. So this is called a light microscope. That's what everybody uses in the lab. There is a special microscope or a special filter called a dark microscope or spindle view. Spindle view is actually what we call it in our lab. So I wonder if this is someone who's been to our lab. Other people call it oocyte or pole scope or something like that. But basically it's a dark microscopy. And can you see my cursor there?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the polar body, okay? So this is where half the chromosomes have been extruded. It's kind of not part of, eventually we'll just absorb. The other 23 chromosomes are supposed to be right underneath here, called the spindle. You can't see them in this microscope, but the spindle is supposed to be under the polar body. So they're supposed to be kind of like this. In the spindle view, you can't see them because it looks different. And sometimes the spindle can be further away from that polar body. So any picture you've ever seen of ICSI, again, this is just from Google Images, you will see that the polar body is either positioned at 12 or at 6, okay? Because we don't want that needle to go anywhere near the spindle, okay? So here you can see a 12 o'clock polar body with the assumption that the spindle view is just under, so we want to be perpendicular to that. So one thing the spindle view will do is it will help us sort of rotate the egg maybe so we can fertilize it. So not every lab in the world uses spindle view for many reasons. Some, don't know about it. Some don't think it's a worth investment. Some think the science isn't strong enough. When we look at our data, I think it improves maybe about 5% or so. So you might say, well, that doesn't help me that much, but we're sort of in the world of like everything adds up.
Great. One last question, because I have a 2 o'clock meeting that I have to be at. Can you give us your Coles Notes thoughts on fresh versus frozen embryo transfers?
Yeah, so this is Dan's Coles Notes. This isn't the Bible of Coles Notes, but so general rule, if you stimulate a lot, so you have a high reserve, you're taking hormone, lots of follicles growing, that's good because you're going to have a whole bunch of eggs and that's going to give you a better chance that the golden egg is there. The two downsides to that is the estrogen levels are going to go higher because you have multiple follicles and you can get quite sick, something called ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, OHSS. So if you're a high responder, you're at least going to get the mild version. That's how you got so many eggs, which is fine. You'll get over that. What we don't want is the moderate or the severe. The people who get super sick are the ones who also get pregnant because that hormone beta-HCG is like fuel to the fire. So people, we think, oh man, you may over-respond. For sure, I would say like we clinicians don't agree with each other, but we all agree on this. If you're a super high responder, don't put an embryo in because we just don't want to get you super sick. Like when we put an embryo in, we're praying for a pregnancy, but that pregnancy is going to make you super sick. So for sure, for them, not. Okay. Also, we think if the estrogen levels are so high, it's probably not supraphysiological. Like it's probably not the ideal environment. So it's not, you can't get pregnant with a fresh, but the statistics show with the high responders, you should do a freeze-all. So I think that's the easy one. I think most people will say, hey, with the freeze-all, with the high responders, freeze-all, okay? Which is a good segment of the patients, the younger patients, high reserve patients, things like that. More and more studies, again, my Coles Notes suggest that the older you are, probably the better you will do in a freeze-all. But I don't think that's wrong to do fresh. People who I traditionally do fresh for is people with the low reserve. They may not have that many embryos. So it's not like their estrogen levels are going to be so high. They can do a fresh transfer. Or truthfully, like long distance patients, like they're flying in from Edmonton, and if we freeze it, they got to start the whole process again in the flying. So we just say, you know what, stick around, we put one embryo in.
Right.
But generally, I would say the whole field, the needle is sort of moving to a freeze all, especially now that people are testing these embryos, which you have to freeze them.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we will have to have you back to talk about endometrial receptivity. So put that in your books. Thank you so much, Dr. Nayot, for joining us today. I think this is incredibly informative. Sorry to everyone about the tech issues that delayed our start, but you'll be able to, we will be posting this to Facebook. So if there's anything that you missed, if you joined late or wanted to listen to Dr. Nayot all over again, it will be posted to our Facebook site and also our YouTube channel. We have another great session next Thursday. And I believe we're taking August off, and then we'll be back in September with lots and lots of content for you through these Figuring Out Fertility Facebook Lives. So stay tuned, go back to our Facebook page and see what events are coming up, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you. Good luck in your journeys, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.